Good evening. I'm Bob Hauser. I'm the Executive Officer of the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge. And I welcome you to this first kind of plenary session for our library conference on networks from Franklin to Facebook. I want to start with a few words about the APS. For those of you who may not be acquainted, if the screen were up, hint, you would be able to see three of our earliest members, including our founder, the silly portrait of Jefferson over yonder, beautiful picture of Mr. Franklin ignoring you while he's reading something in the center, and one of the many Gilbert Stuart portraits of George Washington. We've been around since 1743. We're the oldest and smallest learned academy in the United States of the big three, the APS, National Academy of Sciences, and American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And I could tell you why, if I had the usual 55 minutes for a lecture, both of them could be regarded as spin-offs of the APS. But in any event, there are now about 830 resident members of the APS and about 150 international members. We support research through about 200 small grants and a few fellowships that are heavily peer-reviewed and issued by our research department every year. They're not big grants. They're the kinds of things that I loved when I was a professor. I'm now a recovering academic. But small things to get you either started or finished, and mostly aimed at young folks in every conceivable field of study, in addition to which we have about 40 fellowships, some of which are full year or longer, in the library. We have a publication office. We are the longest running continuously operating scholarly press in the United States since 1771. And we issue our proceedings, our journal, shorter research monographs, and occasional big books, which we call memoirs. And if someone will explain to me why they're called memoirs, I don't know. But they're beautiful big books. We have a museum kitty corner over here. The present exhibition is Mapping a Nation, which is really about the role of the science and art of mapping and the actual maps that created this nation, because they were tools, in some sense, of discovery, of conquest, of conflict, as this nation was begun. And the exhibition features some really important maps in our collections, but also a lot of, tools of the trade, the things that were actually used to create maps early in our nation's history. And then we have the library, the research library that's straight across yonder with about 13 million manuscripts and 250,000 books open to all for research. And there's been a big change in the library that's begun within the last week, which is that we have formed a collaboration with the David Library of the American Revolution up in Bucks County, in which we will take on the parts of their collection that we don't already have. Actually, for safekeeping, we have had their most valuable manuscripts for many, many years. That organization was begun in the late 50s by a gentleman named Saul Feinstone, who was just an avid fan of everything and collector with respect to everything connected to the American Revolution. And we will be creating the only major research center on the American Revolution that exists in this country here in collaboration with the David Library. So we're starting our Franklin to Facebook conference. Next week, we are going to have an international symposium where we will have leaders of quite a number of scientific, scholarly, arts, and like academies from around the world coming here for 2 to 3 days to talk about their future. And we will have one public event here on the evening of, pretty much the same time as now, on the evening of the 13th, which I think is Thursday, in which we will have a panel composed that will to discuss the current state of knowledge, science, facts, all the good things that folks like us care about. It will be moderated by Mark Thompson, who runs the New York Times, and the participants will include Marcia McNutt, president of the National Academy of Sciences, and 4 other leaders of academies from around the world. It's quite a diverse and interesting group who face a variety of different challenges in their regions of the world. So I invite you to attend that then. If you would like to tweet, I have been instructed. The network to look for on your device, whatever it may be, is APS guest, and the not at all secret password is Franklin 1743. So I'm sort of closing where I began here. Franklin 1743 with a capital F will get you online here. And now I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker for the conference. Dr. Augustin Chantrot is an associate professor of computer science. Did I get that close? Not too bad. Thank you. My French is a little rusty. Is an associate professor of computer science at Columbia University, where he's been since 2010, and where he directs the Mobile Social Lab. The goal of his research is to reconcile the benefits of personal data and social networks with a commitment to fairness and privacy. His latest results address transparency and personalization, the role of human mobility and privacy across several domains, the efficiency of crowdsourced content curation, the fairness of incentives and algorithms used in social networking. And he has just is an enormously productive and well-recognized fellow. So, Augustin, it is yours. Good. If I could do this.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Bob, for the wonderful and intimidating introduction, knowing that I'm speaking before such esteemed people. I'm very happy to be here and really thrilled to stay and hear what we will have tomorrow in the rest of the presentation. And I wanted, as we were preparing the symposium, I wanted sort of broad perhaps the point of view of computer scientists who have been working a lot on this topic of circulation and creation of knowledge, and bring also perhaps during this talk, I hope, opening a door to all the opportunities we have where the tools of computer scientists and the knowledge and questioning of other domains, social science, humanities, historian, philosopher, could come together to answer a very big problem. So, if I can achieve that, I'll be really, really happy to have done that today. The title of the talk is a sneak peek at big data shadow text. And you might be wondering what are behind all of these words, and I hope I will clarify that in the next 40 minutes. Basically, I'd like to discuss what is big data and how did it start, when did it start, what was the purpose. I'd like after that to discuss what has been introduced by an eminent scholar as the problem of the two texts, and this is essentially what caused the difference between the first text and the shadow text, which will be the rest of my talk. And then I'd like to play 20 questions with the shadow text. So, my goal as computer scientist is to try, to understand human boxes, algorithm, and we're going to try to sort of understand what's there, somewhat using an experimental approach. And I'll give you essentially, some highlights of some of the results I had on my lab that I hope will be the beginning of a conversation among us. And as I said, all of this is in the spirit of more opportunities to study the shadow text to pose the really important question that we have to face. I learned a couple of things in organizing seminar in this area. So I'm in Columbia University in New York. I'm part of the Data Science Institute, head by Janet Wing, who is a wonderful leader. And the motto she has for the institute is data for good. You know, we're here to build tools, to build knowledge, science that is helping humanity. And that's, you know, a broad goal. And we organize many sessions like that, you know, data for social good. This is an example of, you know, one of those sessions. And, you know, if you get to a good conference and you bring people, you say, okay, we're going to come together and do good. Some people show up. It's nice. Now, if you call the session Big Bad Data, then everybody show up. And I was always like, okay, that's interesting. And, you know, since I'll go over what happened in the next few years about how we shift perhaps from a naive view of technology to perhaps another pessimistic view, I think it tells a little bit what I'm going to talk about today. So we're going to emphasize a little bit the big bad data part, but, you know, I am committed and fully convinced that we can do, you know, social good with data. And why do we see that? Why do we see such a difference? Well, it's not totally surprising. We all know misbehavior is more entertaining, and that's just a fact. We all seen that, you know, since the early days. You probably have seen most of these people, and, you know, they've wrote Don Juan, they've wrote La Princesse de Clèves, they've wrote Emma, Crime and Punishment. Those are great books about people misbehaving. And there's no doubt that, you know, we had many, many other stories about technology that fit this narrative. So, you know, it makes great stories. Misbehaving is really interesting. You want to show up. Maybe some of you show up today because the talk was telling you a little bit about the dark side of social media. So I think it's good. I mean, you know, we definitely want to do that. It's probably because we care about where things can go wrong a little bit more than hearing sort of, you know, apology of a technique. Now, we have to be careful, though, because a lot more of these stories are being written right now, sometimes without the complete cautious of, you know, scientists and people who really ground themselves in facts and rigorous evaluation. And I've seen, you know, a little bit in the few years, a little bit too much of the negative side of technology, and in particular some of the claim in some even actually research papers that were going a little too far. So we have to be careful, you know, distinguishing what is a nice fiction from what is a true ground, you know, disparate impact or bad thing that technology has been found. And, you know, my claim is that if we want together, we are here in the American Philosophical Society, we definitely want to address this very big problem as an attempt at an objective truth. We all know objective truth is complicated and there's many aspects to it, but at least we would like to get there. We, and that's my claim, need to study the shadow text, and I'm going to describe what it is in a minute. And sort of, you know, I think it's very important to go there to have real knowledge and pass beyond the sort of, you know, fiction and narratives and what we expect or we suspect or we fear from technology and data to really ground ourselves in facts. So this talk is a lot about my story on how to do that for years. So before, you know, giving you a little bit of the highlight, actually, this is usually a part of the talk where I ask for inputs from the audience, but I think it's a bit of an intimidating auditorium, so I'll do the dialogue myself. But you might ask this question, when would we start organize and automate our life around data? I mean, maybe all generations will have different answers. Some people will name the beginning of the internet as the Big Bang. Some might say, you know, it's when we started just writing the cuneiform tablets of the Babylonians. Maybe the printing press was, you know, an important one. Maybe the American Revolution, or maybe, you know, another big event like that. I tend to situate that moment where big data started in the half between the first and the second industrial revolution, the 1830s, 1840s. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, it was also another time where, you know, we were wondering about the viability and real success of democracy, at least in Europe, in France especially. That's the time where Tocqueville came to America and reflected on how to protect individuals from the mass of democracy. And moreover, we were trying to scale a manufactured society. And a couple of things started then that kind of were the model for everything we've been doing before. So you probably know how to get to a shop, look at something you need, look at the price, that's a fixed public price, and you go and you pay that price. Well, that model started in 1834 in Harrods in London, and also, you know, a very, very little time after in Paris in Le Bon Marché. And it was revolutionary, because before that, you didn't have any fixed public retail price. You were going to a shop, you know the owner, they had some expectation of what you can pay, and you were sort of haggling and negotiating. That was since dawn of time how people make commerce. But there was an idea that, okay, now we have too many consumers with so many, a new sort of middle class. There's new goods, things coming from far away. This is a bit complicated. We need information to, extract the best from our consumers. And instead of training lots of sale people, that would be complicated. We're just going to have one person choosing a good price, and we're going to rule the market this way. 1834. Another question that appeared also during those decades was, now you're being part of another community. Maybe you move down to one of these big centers like London and Paris, and suddenly there's a lot of facts that really affect you. You need to understand things that happens in your area, in your city, and for that you need sort of to be knowledgeable. There's a big problem of how we're going to fund places where you will learn about those facts. And so far, the model has been that gazette, newsletter, and newspaper were primarily the organ of political party. Like you would be either a Tory or a radical, and you will basically read the newspaper associated with one of these political organs. And in 1836, in France, actually, the first newspaper that decided that actually, instead of having a direct influence from a political party, we could have information paying for itself through advertisement, was this journal called La Presse, which started in 1836. And there was an idea that maybe by, essentially paying through advertisement, that could be any form of advertisement, the form in which we can provide facts to everyone would be a little bit more neutral. And also, you could fund a much cheaper journal that many more people could afford. And also at that time in the US, sort of around that time was the beginning where big newspapers started to cover nationwide audience. And it was sort of a time where the country expanded with perhaps more territory in the West and others. And it was very hard to start having politicians to be accountable, because someone will come to New Jersey, make a great speech promising something, and then go to California and make another speech promising something else. There was no way to basically compare that. And at that time, starting the New York Tribune, sort of the prehistorical newspaper for the nation that after that became the other newspaper we know, was sort of beginning. All of that, addressing the problem that the country and the community is getting larger, and we need to address that. And interestingly, in many ways, the internet perfected that success. A fixed public retail price was essentially simplifying all commerce. Instead of having to go in each boutique and maintaining a relationship with anyone, you could walk down to any shop and get the same price. Now you can, through clicks, go to any website in the world and order from a retailer in Denmark to get goods shipped to you in the US. If you think about the number of content we are reading all the time, maybe right now on your device, that is paid through ads, it's mind-boggling. And in some form, having a public, accountable broadcast system like Twitter has been sort of considered a way to in some way, export democracy in other parts of the world. So the internet sort of stayed with this model and sort of continued a little bit. On the other hand, I was sort of working on the internet for a while, for 20 years, when at the early of the 2010s, we started noticing a few trends in how the internet was used. And strangely, almost the reverse trend of the thing I just described to you. That was basically at the time where the data revolution and the multiplication of personal data started to change how we use the internet. In 2012, for the first time, price discrimination appears on website. That seems to be somewhat undue. And the first canonical example was shown by the Wall Street Journal just in time for Christmas in 2012, and showed that if you visit staple websites, based on the zip code you indicate at the very beginning, which is only associated with your cookies and has nothing to do with your credit card or your delivery address, that piece of information will change the price of the goods that you are going to order through the website. Sort of, a complete reverse of the public fixed retail price that everyone was expecting to be their experience. And one of the consequences of that was that because the way the algorithm works was based essentially on competition, so if your zip code will have no competitors, especially rural zip code or areas that are more disenfranchised, the website could actually literally add $1, and they know that you wouldn't be pissed off and just go to the streets and go buy it somewhere else in Manhattan, especially if you're in the middle of a quite far away place. So that started to create online barrier for people that are in particular area of the country that seems perhaps not what we would like to obtain. Also, around that time, in the communication of the ACM in 2013, Latanya Sweeney showed that sponsor and organic results from search engine were heavily biased by race. The canonical example was that if you were searching for a lawyer or a doctor, if the first name was a typically first name that was found with a higher frequency among African American population, what you will obtain is ads asking to check for the criminal arrest record. Click here and learn if that person had a criminal arrest. And those ads will not be shown to typical first names that were sort of, much more common across ethnic groups. And that's, the person who ran that study actually is Afro-American, and she just realized that by seeing this ad all the time, and someone said, why do you see this ad? I don't see them. And at that time, that moment was, a realization, and then through experiments, they were able to prove that. And also, around that time in 2012, the New York Times ran an article that showed that political websites for the midterm of the 2012 election, back when the midterm were boring and no one cared about it, actually, they were actually the first time nano-targeting, which means that, if you were visiting this candidate website, based on what was contained in your cookie, did you visit a religious website or an adult website, you will be greeted with a very different message that the candidate will put forward. And that's the first sign that perhaps, this idea that there is a broadcast to everyone that was sort of, the idea of the medium in the first place has been, again, a little bit changed. And there's an article from ProPublica, that looked at additional personalization of campaign message for the Obama campaign. All of this appears relatively early, and I was among the people paying notice to that, but not too many people cared. I mean, it seemed like, okay, sure, there's a little bit things to adjust, etc. So you might think, okay, big deal. Since then, we corrected. Those were a little bump in the road, and now we went to a nice future. Unfortunately, the last 4 years proved me that we had a lot of things to see. So these are a couple of articles we had to, on research that I'm going to discuss in a minute, that were all, basically showing that we having this problem over and over. The big data and the way we use it challenge our values. What we expect, commerce, organization, and political parties the way to treat us. So far I was saying, maybe it couldn't get any worse. We got it right. Well, unfortunately, 2016, a little later, proved that even before any event, a few events happened in 2016, but even before that, personalization already runs the gamut of all moral hazard. So I'm taking 3 examples from October 2016, nothing to do with, a recent election, and that were all sort of showing a big trend. So in hiring, the Washington Post showed in October 31st of 2016 that the sharing economy could exacerbate discrimination. Essentially, a Uber driver will basically discriminate on client based on their profile pictures. That was sort of, an important article at the time. Related to information, ad and housing jobs could exclude recipient based on race. That was an article shown in ProPublica, starting with the housing based on race. You would essentially be able to have your ad on Facebook only be played to people that would be not Latino or African American. And the researcher went as far as creating their own ads and seeing that they could basically do it and even be validated by Facebook and went into the process of repeating that a few years later until Facebook eventually in 2 months ago actually went into changing the actual ad networks to exclude ad housing ad from their regular platform without necessarily having the final answer to that problem. That was from ProPublica, and in the realm of surveillance and politics, the ACLU of North California and the Washington Post reported on that same month that Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram were used by law enforcement in order to monitor protests, and typically by having a racial demographic bias. So you would basically pick particular keywords that would be related to Black Lives Matters movement as a way to deploy law enforcement officials and look for policing in some particular neighborhood. And all of that was before anything happened in 2016. And of course, since then, I don't have to tell you that we had more scandals from Cambridge Analytica, effect of facial recognition being biased by skin colors, effect of other form of discrimination, including a few other big ones that I may forget. And what happens? What's at the core of that? Well, there's many literature that has been being written on that. I read a lot of them, and I can recommend basically 2 things to read. The first one, if you like to reconcile big data with value, is actually the very original report in 2014. After this first wave of events showing that our value are changed by big data, that was served by the White House at the time. John Podesta became famous later on during the campaign for his email. At that time was only famous for making reports for the White House. And he had this sentence that properly implemented, big data will become an historic driver for progress. Unfortunately, it also has the potential to exclude long-standing civil rights. That's the first thing I recommend you read if you want to sort of go beyond the headlines. The second thing you can read was just published a few months ago by Shoshana Zuboff. This is now this monumental work on the age of surveillance capitalism, where I actually borrow a lot of the concept, without her eloquence, of course. And she basically describes the problem we see as the fact that there are two texts. And in fact, the reason why this matters is because she, as an analogy, says that, for our grandparents, the first modernity, people coming from Europe and coming to Europe and to the US and seeing that their life could be shaped by the job they choose, the division of labor was everything. And, Marxism and, capitalism were 2 ways to really think very differently about division of labors. Here we are basically entering the problem where the division of learning is for a generation what used to be that for them. And we have basically 2 texts in social media. The first text that we write, that we read, that is explicit, that is sort of serving us and making our life convenient. But the first text doesn't stand alone. There is actually a shadow text that's supply operation for the second text. And in some form, and the book that I recommend you give yourself a few months to read and really understand at the core of this problem, is basically saying that the ability to control these 2 texts together produce an unprecedented asymmetry in the division of learning, and hence an asymmetry of knowledge and power. And this is a problem we are struggling with. And in fact, all the cases I've showed you were example where, because of the opacity and the incredible power that you have if you have all the knowledge, all the data, and you can basically choose to tune the algorithm one way or another, and without any sort of check and transparency system, that clearly can be a recipe for asymmetrical power and no countervailing. So what is contained in the first and the shadow text? Well, very briefly, the first text, it's familiar, and it's celebrated all over the place as the universe of information and connection it brings to unfingertip. It's about creating and circulating knowledge on Facebook, and it is very important. I mean, Facebook had a lot of benefits, and social media brings very, very important service and very important conversation to happen. And Google's web result, Google Map result, Facebook walls, the news feed, the notification of all social media you can imagine are all part of the first text, and they matter quite a lot. The shadow text is essentially the burgeoning accumulation of behaviors and its analysis, but those are typically admins to other ends. This is what you click, what you search. Facebook even have a paper about what you started typing but deleted before pressing return. This is how detailed this accumulation of knowledge gets. This is also where you are, and it's everything that is inferred by others about it. And I want to emphasize a couple of things about those 2 texts. The first is that those are not simple texts like a book you would read from A to Z. Those are composed texts. There is partly facts and there is partly algorithms that look at the facts and create narratives, create prediction, create sort of some estimation of it. The first text contain algorithmic output. For instance, the results of Google are ranked, or the recommendation you receive on Facebook or the newsfeed composition are all made by algorithm. And the typical impression is that in the first text, the algorithm are at our service. We expect those algorithms to assist us and to bring us more opportunities. In the shadow text, there are lots of algorithms too, and those are typically absolutely not under the service of the user. They are under the service of whatever makes the behavioral and the revenue you can extract from knowing these behaviors and placing or proposing a particular action in interest to another person. And what's kind of puzzling is that the first text is very complex, very hard. I mean, it contains all the web and all the things we share on Facebook. In some way, someone controls it. I mean, Facebook has, it's very complicated, but in all the database, a sort of access to the entirety of this first text. And somehow each of us has some access to that. At least one human see part of the first text every time it is played. But the shadow text is much more evasive. In a way, no one, not even Facebook or Google, knows exactly what's happening in the shadow text. So a typical example would be when there were an example that it was seen that ads in Google were selectively showing high-paying job ads primarily to male and not to female on some platform. It was the Google ad platform of ad search. There was a big question, which is like, why do we see this and who is to blame? Is it Facebook? Sorry, not Facebook, because it wasn't about Facebook. Is it the actual engine, Google itself, that sort of made this up? Is it one algorithm that, of course, without any intention, caused that? Is it someone else, like the advertisers, that deliberately try to gear the ads toward this? Or is it an intermediary, someone who is sort of in the business of passing information from one entity to another, who at some point create an algorithm that perpetuates this bias? The answer is very puzzling, and no one can really answer that because the shadow text is a composition of lots of parties that together cooperate in order to interact and understand our behaviors. So this is very hard, and even if you were, at Facebook, at Google, and try to completely comprehend the entirety of the shadow text, you couldn't really do that. That doesn't mean you cannot start a quest to understand and analyze it very well, and that's what I'm going to come in a minute. Before I describe my work, I just want to you probably have seen this before. These concepts are relatively familiar, but perhaps what's important is to understand three behaviors with regard to the shadow text. There's basically three strategies. The first strategy is to flee. That's called privacy. You just don't want to be in the shadow text. It becomes harder and harder. This is a strategy where you say, well, I think there's a problem, and I'm going to prevent my data to get even in there. And it has some merit, especially in very, very critically case like your health information and others. That seems to be an important guarantee we should expect. It offers strong individual protection because your data are not even there. And it includes a protection against any future threat because if the data are not there, no one is going to be later able to use that to infer anything, even in a different universe where your data may come back to haunt you. The problem is it's very complex to do that. I'll show a couple of examples why. There's a difficult know of where is the incentives. Everyone should expect the user to want that right. But it has been shown again and again that if you give people a rational choice, they would probably like convenience and cheap service over some that are more private and require payment. So it's difficult to know how to do that, and there is inherently a utility. I mean, if things were completely private, if every health information were remaining in people's drawer, you wouldn't be able to, sometimes discover trends that are important for us to understand more public health issues. The second strategy is to constrain, to say, this is not right. The shadow text and whatever it does to our data and play should follow some set of rules. And it's very good. And there have been in the last few years, renewed interest in doing that. This is essentially taking the core of the engine of machine learning and artificial intelligence and have some part of the code, a test or a certification and a proof that enforces that a particular fairness that we determine in advance is satisfied by the machine and even machines together interacting. There are some complexity in how to do that. The main merit is that if you know truly what you want to be fair, you can enforce it. And a typical example would be if you wanted hiring ads to be shown with exactly the same percentage to profile that indicates a male gender or a female gender, you could possibly achieve that statistically speaking. The big obstacle here is that it's very hard to achieve unless you cooperate with whoever is running the shadow text. It's going to be hard to do that from the outside. So you probably need a form of regulation, audit, and accountability that is a system that is yet to be built. And another problem is that we don't really know if there is a satisfying definition of fairness. Obviously, there are multiple definitions that will apply in different ways. It's hard to know who decides which definition is the best. And you may enter a big debate about that. And then the third thing, which is my word, because those are wonderful but perhaps a little too demanding, is to work on what works when none of that works. And what works when you can't accept that you're going to receive help from your provider, or when your data are not protected anymore and your privacy is lost. What works is transparency. You basically reveal what's going on, you prove it rigorously. Sometimes you have to work harder to explain why it's coming, and that's actually a difficult point. And sometimes you can fix it. Hopefully, it starts a feedback loop. You know, if people who do bad things with data at some point get accountable, there starts to be an incentive to not do bad things, and also the people who do good things will be rewarded for being shown to do, you know, the proper way. So the main merit of that method is that it's often the only one you have. If you can do something to bring more transparency to a field that is sort of, you know, dangerous, that's at least some progress, and it brings some accountability, even if it might be indirect. The limitation is that there's a big question of scale, and also definitely a focus on current threat. Like, if you run some transparency engine and show that right now in the shadow text, no one gets discriminated based on their age in looking for jobs, that doesn't tell you anything about what happens in 2 years. The data are still there, new algorithm will be in place, maybe the environment will have changed and you will have to restart again. So there's obviously this limitation coming all the time. So that's, you know, this motto of many of my work was that sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants. That's a quote from Justin Brandeis in the beginning of the century. How many times do I have left? Okay, sure, perfect. So I was saying playing 20Q with the shadow text, but it's late, so we'll play only 3Q, if that's okay with you. I have 17 other Q to be over a glass of wine or something like that tomorrow. I heard there's some cancel talk, so I can bring more. But that's basically what I propose to do. So the first question, before doing that, sneaking into the shadow text, raise a few questions that I want to sort of introduce first. Can we even know anything for certain in the shadow text? I mean, you describe this shadow text as this evasive thing that is impossible. Not even Google know about it. So what can you claim that you can at least get even for certain? So the answer to that question is yes, we can. I'll give you a few examples. We can even determine causal effect in the shadow text. So we can go quite far. Of course, there are limitations of scale, of cost, and there's another big limitation, which is you can typically find the causal effect of the big black box, but it's very hard to point blame and say something bad happened and it's because this particular middle segment caused it. That is something that requires more experiment and do more. So that's my quick answer to that. Second question: is that even legal to do that? Interestingly, that question is not answered yet, since there's a current case started in 2016 that was originally answered in the beginning of 2018, but has been re-updated by the University of Michigan, Illinois, and Northeastern University to essentially pose any form of web transparency research as a legal form of searching through the system. And it is currently in debate, and I'm not a lawyer, so I can't answer that question. But we're doing our best to stay within the law and not have our PhD student go to jail. Another question which perhaps I care more about is when is that ethical? Legal, of course, depends on the current text, but in general, what's really scientifically ethical to do. So typically today, this is decided by university IRBs, and we are following the usual rule of we have to weigh the potential harm. We have to be careful and be good custodian of the data we have. That's for the US. There are other similar regulation in Europe, and it is across the whole field of university researcher a big deal. This may not extend to absolutely all researchers, because some researchers in industry are actually not bound by IRBs or any form like that. But this is definitely something that our research community care a lot about. Many conferences will not accept your paper if that violates, obviously, one of the terms of the ethics that this community stands for. And a surprising question to answer is also, okay, now that we know that we're going to look at the shadow text, obviously there will be a counteraction. Obviously, if someone, now that right now you can learn something about their tool, they're going to change the tool so that it's hard to get. And one question would be, can we even win this arms race between, a whole powerful web giant and little people trying to measure? Surprisingly, there are progress. So, I would say we will for sure win this arms race. That's a little too optimistic. But on the other hand, the other viewpoint to say there's no hope, the harm race is lost in advance to people with the data is actually wrong. It has been proven wrong. And one of the reasons for that is that you definitely need to, at some point, play the shadow text to people in order to profit and benefit. And so if you do large abuse through data at scale, at some point it's going to be hard to do that without being noticed. So there's a trade-off of how much you can do without being noticed that is at the core of this question, which can be answered positively. So now, without further ado, a couple of questions we can do with the shadow text. So, one question is, if the shadow text is a novel, if it's like a book we can read, we'd like to know, are we characters of that novel? What's the name we have in this novel? If you read lots of Russian novels, they have lots of names, the patronym, the diminutive, and it's horrible to follow. Well, probably it's the same in the shadow text. We have multiple names. We maintain multiple accounts. How is it to identify a person? Well, that problem has been covered a lot by the research literature. Typically, I'm showing you an example. This is what happens in a shadow text. Imagine that I'm going for breakfast, and then I'm buying a pizza, and I'm going to buy a bagel. So, at 9 a.m., I make a call from home. At 1 p.m., I call. In the shadow text of my phone, there will be 2 records. And then, maybe through my credit card, I buy at 10 a.m. a bagels on my way to work. I buy a pizza for lunch. And at 1 p.m., I buy coffee after that. So in a shadow text world, those would be essentially 2 identities that would say, at this time, you were there. At this time, you were here. At this time, you bought something. At this time, you were home. Because you made call on the left and purchase on the right. Those would be essentially under 2 identities that are not clearly necessarily shown to be the same person, but what we have shown, many others have, of course, shown and reproduced, is that even in data sets that look like this, you can quite easily pinpoint that there is, what did I do? You can quite easily pinpoint that that person here is the same as that person here, because that is the only one that shares sufficient geographical location across a few points to coordinate and determine that it is the same person. In other words, a little bit of information about you is typically a unique signature to recognize you in many different parts of the shadow text. And in fact, most of the ad networks and most of the system, caring to study your behavior, analyze it, and personalize your result, the first step they do is sort of reconcile identity across different domains using this system. So your identity in the shadow text is pretty clear to many people, and you don't even have a name, but you are uniquely identified by a quick fingerprint that could be easily to obtain. And that's probably why privacy is so hard, because in order to lie, you will have to lie a lot, and probably start affecting a lot the way you receive service before you can hope to evade that. And as an example, this is how we run tests. That was just an example, but we did it for what you do on Foursquare and Twitter. On that last one, that was for a data set where we saw where people made call with their cell phone and where did they do bank transactions. So 2 things were 2 databases that were completely in different domains that had nothing in common. And we were able to re-identify which cell phone was which credit card user based just on the location of the data that were obtained, with different performance metrics that I won't go into detail to discuss. Another question you may have is, what's behind those data? I mean, now that I know that I have a name and I can be identified, what do I have? Many apps use my location and ask things like that. Uber would like to use your location. Good luck getting an Uber if you say don't allow. So you're going to have to do this. But OK, maybe that sounds fair. I mean, Uber wants to send a car where you are. They need to know your location. One question would be, what's behind this revelation? So we build a tool to basically demo to every user what is revealed by your location. And this is, on the x-axis, how you generalize your location to a much larger radius. So here you're giving your location up to a block group in Manhattan, so that's a couple of blocks of Manhattan. And here this is all the way to the state, so you're just saying, I'm in New York, send me a Uber in New York state, which is pretty bad. And you see that on the y-axis, we're looking at the accuracy to determine your race. And this accuracy remains quite high until you basically stop having any information in the data. I mean, when you start giving your location at the level of state or county, you're basically really sort of at a very coarse grain. And that's what it takes to remove that particular identity. And there was a demo actually where you could sort of put your social media, have just your location. We don't look at any of the content, and the result will tell you we predict you are of a particular ethnic type, and that goes for as well socioeconomic status, age, do you have children, a couple of other sort of demographics. So yes, you're pretty much identifying the shadow text. You don't have an explicit name, although it's probably easy to find it, and you probably are hard to evade that. That's basically the answer to the first question. Maybe a little bit sobering. The second question could be, why does the shadow text show me these ads? Well, we know they want to make money and they need to show ads, that makes sense, but what precisely, why do I see this particular ad right now? What caused it in the past or in the present? So if the shadow text is novel, what caused which plot? I mean, right now the shadow text is showing me something, and I would like to know what's behind that. I would like to analyze that. So in a form, it's like reversing the opacity of the web. You probably use an email service, and you probably share information on this email, just like regular email. Are you coming? We're waiting. And you receive an ad, internet fax. Then you make another email. This one may be a bit more revealing, maybe more sensitive. You're asking a friend about gay bars for a future trip you're doing. That sort of indicates your sexual orientation. Or you may have a personal situation dealing with a tragic medical situation, and you're asking a friend for advice. The system is going to take that into account and continue to play you ads. Maybe you receive this ad for a charity event for cancer survivor. Probably that relates to the email you had. That seems, an inference. And you receive an ad for an hotel in a particular town. The problem is that you basically have no idea what it is, so you can play with the system and create fake email just to check what's going to happen next to that email. So we actually did that, created emails that were absolutely only talking about a particular sensitive topic, like an email probably nobody will send. Similar, we did this one, we did others. And then, we saw ads, and the tool we did was basically something that decipher which ads were targeted by which email. Sorry, which email were targeted by which ad. So through this tool, we were able to basically look at the shadow text of the associations that it creates and understand what are the sort of pattern and narrative that people are trying to impose based on what you share from your information. So we found, for instance, that's not a real example, we changed it, but we found an hotel that was, without really a clear reason why, targeting people based on their sexual orientation. And that was clearly the only cause in the system that caused this. We found examples of surprising association between medical condition and different results. And I want to emphasize that in many of these discoveries, sometimes we found a sort of positive social attitude to use the information. A typical example where when we made one email about being depressed, we saw ads from a government app that is helping teenagers against cyberbullying. And that seems like a wonderful use of personal information. I mean, you clearly cannot send that to everyone in the population. And so being able to use the age and the particular current well-being or mental health would be a fantastic use of personal data. The problem is that next to that, we saw another ad that was proposing to buy some flask to carry liquor around. And for the same email, that starts to be a little bit of a problem. So we are, we're basically not here to judge whether that's a proper use. That probably is to the domain of ethicists, social scientists, journalists, people with that. We are just here to reveal and provide information for others to study. So you might ask, is there disparate treatment? Well, we found pretty much all of them. We found that's an example based on ethnic ethnicity. So if you're talking about being part of a Dominican community, you will receive ad for particular shampoo. 93% of the time that was in context, which means that ad was played next to the email, which shows, okay, at least the system was playing it next to the information, so there's a form of transparency. On the other hand, we found that that particular brand was targeting people based on sexual orientation, and the context was relatively low. So that means 1 out of 4 times you're receiving this ad, you have no idea why, but it's a previous email that was actually indicating something about you that you may not realize. And we had other examples, including religious targeting, ancestry, and other family search for Mormon and Muslims and Jewish especially. And we found other for depression, for Alzheimer's syndrome, and that. And by far, the largest we found was that if you talk about financial difficulty, you will receive ads for very bad loan. Essentially, that was sort of one of the big use of ad at this time. And That is history because as we were running this experiment, Gmail stopped playing ads to Gmail users. You probably didn't notice, which proves they did a good job at removing it because nobody looked at them. But that was basically on the right side of Gmail when you were logging, and that is gone. So probably as a coincidence as we were doing it. So we have no more data. We probably have some data about the last ad shown on Gmail. And I don't want to go into the detail, but you might wonder, how do we answer that scientifically with some certitude and statistical confidence? Well, it comes from the fact that for every of this profile, if you imagine that you want to know why you recommended 2 bakery, let's say if you want to buy a croissant in Ithaca, New York, where Cornell is located. Well, if your account has 3 email or 3 places you've been to Harlem, the Upper East Side, and Chelsea, you don't know with all this information why do you receive those 2 recommendations. But if you create fake accounts that are basically a subset of all your accounts, all your items, including one that is completely empty, and you observe the distribution of ads of all of them after a while, under some relatively benign assumption on how ads are placed and how randomness distributes those ads to the targeting and the non-targeting account, you can pretty much decipher what is the formula behind them. The big question is, can you do that at scale for lots of ads at the same time and run that efficiently, which was why it was a computer science problem. So the mystery is solved by a lot of experiment and basically playing fake account on those systems to continue to learn. I'm not going to go into this detail. And then finally, a big question we are wondering now is, if the shadow text is so important, if it has, sometimes we can get a little torchlight in it and understand a few things. Can we see other trends, like general prejudice against particular groups? And one of the questions that is behind is that this shadow text that in many cases is considered an optimization of a market and somewhat neutral by the fact that a market decides a price to show to some particular people. There's no intention directly because no one controls it in a strong hand. Unfortunately, you can find evidence of prejudice. So the example that I'm showing here is on the glass ceiling. So you probably are familiar with the effect that if you're part of a minority in a particular group, primarily women in corporate world, it's very hard to get to the top corporate ladder. And there are many reasons, and social scientists working on understanding the cause and the effect of that. In the Wall Street Journal, for instance, showed that only a handful of women make it to the C-suite. That was sort of a recent article they had. But in the online world, that happens too. It has been shown that controlling for activity and age of account, male tend to have more tweets, more followers, and more likes for content they're producing on Twitter. Similarly, for scientific production and mentoring in scientific networks. And that's just sort of a visual representation. We like to know what is the percentage of women after we set the bar higher and higher in the corporate world. If you look at the entry, I did this again. If you look at the entry point, it's relatively balanced with a 4% difference between women and men. But as you go to manager, senior manager, VP, and C-suite, the percentage of women is decreasing. We run similar experiment. We wanted to understand that, the shadow text of recommendation online and social media. So first we collected results from Instagram, starting from Instagram founder and their follower and the people who liked the content on each of these accounts. That created a large data set with 500,000 nodes and 650,000 edges between them. And then we ran recommendation algorithms, the one that I published, that everyone published in our conference and discussed their various effects and how it is. And what we found was a disturbing trend, which is if you look at the network itself and you look at the top 1%, so the people who have the more attention. So if you look at the one who have more attention by the current or the current like and comments in the data we had, there is already a little imbalance, which is that 53% of men compose the top 1% versus 47% women. So there's a slight imbalance, which is a little also aggravated by the fact that women were a minority in the first place in this data set. They were about 54%. So you should expect 54% and you get only 47%. So there's already a little bit of a bias that is contained in the social network. But after we run a recommendation algorithm, and when we look at the top 1%, not by comments received, but by recommendation being produced by an algorithm, then we found that the top 1% was 62% men and 32% women. So there was a bias, no doubt, in the graph in the beginning, but somehow the algorithm, for whatever reason in the shadow text, decided to amplify this bias. And if you were accounting for the fact that this recommendation is going to be probably what causes attention in the future. Those were simulation. It's not real recommendations that were played on Instagram, but they were simulated in the lab using the data and the similar technique. You could expect that that algorithm in that situation will basically amplify the bias more and more as you basically introduce recommendation. So probably a disturbing trend, and we wanted to sort of get at the bottom of it. So this is just a trend showing this is just one case for the top 1%, but this is just to show you a graphical difference. This is how the fraction of female, which is shown on the y-axis, is dropping as you basically go from number of comments being from 1 to 500, 1,000, 5,000. So as you get more and more comments, the fraction of female decrease. That's in the original organic network, and that is if you introduce recommendation algorithm. So there's a big gap between that, which would be the natural sort of disparate outcome you observe in the network and the disparate outcome created by algorithm. So we wanted to understand why is there this amplification of bias, and it's very important to go beyond just observing it, because clearly there was, it was a puzzle even for the social media company, why is this happening? And so we had to work hard through science and understand, thanks to sociologists and other people who worked in the past on modeling social network, to see at the core what caused it. So there's a particular theorem, which I won't go in troubling you with the proof, that shows that under particular conditions that are quite prevalent in many, many natural networks being produced, some of them that we will discuss tomorrow, the fact that the particular heuristic that the algorithm of the shadow text was using, which is based on friends of friends, and basically ranking people who have more friends in common as being good to be recommended, that will basically capture the homophilous part of the network, which is the more in bias of the majority, and will basically reproduce and amplify the bias. So that's because there were a real understanding of what was composing the network, that we could understand what the algorithm was doing. But it took, it was actually a difficult question, and I had to basically, went through a lot of effort. So as I said, in my conclusion, I wanted to bring possibility for this workshop. So why we need a network symposium is very important. We need one tomorrow, is because I think the future circular phenomenon of knowledge cannot ignore the shadow text and this asymmetry of power that it creates. I mean, as I was joking, I was wondering if we will even have circulation of knowledge in 100 years at this rate that we're going, where most of the knowledge is circulated by people we don't know in this shadow text information than the one we are really seeing. Obviously, that's not that dramatic, but we definitely need to address this question. And I have a basically call for arms, because as computer scientist, in my research community, I presented my research, but there are many others, successful projects that are wonderful. They have wonderful tools. Our tools mostly work. We can really use them, and sometimes we reveal interesting trends. But most of the time, we can't really explain our findings without real understanding of the domain. I mean, in some very simple substrate solution, we are able to figure out what the domain is doing. But in a very complex system with multiple factors, we need to work with social scientists and domain experts. And we certainly cannot pose the most insightful question. I mean, computer scientists are very good at solving a puzzle. One, you formulate the puzzle, but finding what's really important to ask and what is contained in the data is not a computer scientist's job most of the time. And so we really need to go beyond our limited imagination to engage with what you consider are really important. And this is a chance for many interdisciplinary effort, and that's why I'm so happy to be here today and hear about your research and see how we can move that forward. Thank you so much.
Some questions. So we have time for a couple questions, if anyone has. No? Okay.
Thank you, Augustin. C'était super. Any touching example of how these texts are transforming our society? Any aspect of transformational that these texts are affecting our society today?
You're asking the wrong person, but I have seen some people who have better answers than mine. The biggest trend, I think, there is the trend that we see of overexposure and overprotection. Use people who are using social media who tell too much about themselves and regretting, and some that do the opposite. They don't tell anything because they're afraid. So that definitely is a transformation I see, even in my students and all of that. That I think is profound. And beyond that, I think the main thing people are worried is that since many of these tools are sort of introduced with an element of objectivity and scientific design that is supposedly, not intentionally misbehaving, there is an expectation that if we see a disturbing trend, we should sort of accept. We should be habituated to the fact that yes, the algorithm is going to amplify the bias towards underrepresented community in a particular field, but that's how life goes, and I think that's where we should stop. I mean, this is not true. I mean, when an algorithm is doing a worse job than even the bias present in the natural social networks, then we should act. And that, I think, is where making that call is difficult, because you have to really, really work hard to understand the difference between those two. And anything else is going to be the realm of fiction, people expecting things and not necessarily having the proof. So that's where we are. Thanks for the question.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I was really struck by that slide that depicted how an algorithm actually amplified the gender bias.
Okay.
And that led me to the following question. Can you say, or would you agree with the following statement, that maybe there is, algorithms, there are some limitations that are implicit to them, and that maybe algorithm is a pretty, rigid structure for comprehending the complexities of human society, of human nature and human behavior. And another question that follows from this question is, if we want to fix the shadow text, would an algorithm be a solution to fix it, or should we look for some other instruments?
Oh, wow. That's very profound questions. Thanks. For the first one, I want to emphasize that particular bias was caused by the structure of the network, and essentially the algorithm was heuristic. It was saying, if people have friends in common, they probably are more likely to create friends. I'm going to recommend that. And that was sort of a trick, and that trick turned to be amplifying bias. And there are many examples like that. You could imagine if you say, I'm only going to give credit to people who already have credit, you're going to amplify bias, and that's why we need to rule and not make those trick to be bad. So that's an example. There are many other examples of algorithm misbehaving that I'm not covering here that are more in the area of machine learning. Typically, if you have a bias training data, like if you train your hiring algorithm on past hire and you only hire from Ivy League and prominently male, without even telling anything, the algorithm may just say, that's what you like, I'm going to predict that. So there's a good question on how to remove the bias in the training data. And then there's other situation in which, because all of these algorithms sort of need to manage a trade-off, like it's going to be costly to learn a particular value of something, and sometimes there are populations for which it's easy to learn, and somewhere it's harder to learn, and so the algorithm is say, my budget is best spent on learning those, and then it sort of forgets to do the job of doing that. Now, to answer your question, how to fix that, it goes back a little to my slide with the three things. My own answer is we need those three. We definitely need transparency that wakes up everyone that there are bad things. It's very helpful, and it should be constantly on the watch, and we should fund things like this society, the CLU, and many other watchdogs. That's very important, but that's not sufficient. We need also algorithms that are shown to be working under safe conditions, under some form of restriction, and we definitely need also privacy, which is more going to be your own choice being made. And I think if we use all of those, they are complementary. We could possibly mitigate the harm of the shadow text. I'm never going to say we fixed it forever, but we can definitely progress well.
Patrick, and then I got you.
Thanks. I have a question about the algorithms, too. It's somewhat related. Sure. Can you talk about the life and evolution of an algorithm? Because I'm sure it's at one point created, but then the feedback based on users clicking on things, the algorithm itself is changing, and that's why nobody actually knows what the algorithm really is.
Yes.
And then how do these companies then evaluate whether or not the algorithm is accomplishing what they want, regardless of what the outcomes that you're showing are?
So there are meta-learning algorithms who are sort of, an algorithm that is studying an algorithm and sort of see when the algorithm is stuck and push it, and that would be sort of this dynamic evolution. What I showed here was a pretty simple common neighbors heuristic that would be a sort of fixed rule, like a mathematical formula. So this one doesn't evolve, but it may change as the network evolves. So it could be that, because it's dependent on the environment condition, at some point the homophily is stronger in a particular cluster and the algorithm is reinforcing it there, but then there's a counter effect. You could have this effect happening. And here we used a very simple, monolithic algorithm that was published, but in practice, all these companies have multiple facets to the algorithm. The recommendation on Facebook and Google is no more a single mathematical formula. It takes into account many things, including reversing the effect of people trying to cheat the algorithm, so you have a lot of protection. So there's a big question, which is when you have such composition, how can you ensure that some harm is not created? So there's a lot of people working on this, constraining the learning to be, okay, it's going to continue to find its way, but respect some rules. And I think, a big question for this audience is, which rule should it respect? Because we could say, okay, you want every day that the ad is shown the same to men and women, but that's not such a great rule, especially, you could have fields where literally right now there are more women qualified and you're underserving women applicants by forcing that it's exactly proportional to their number. And you could have also effects of like, right now the market has more opportunities for women than for male elsewhere, and so less are coming, but that doesn't mean you need to enforce that rule. So this is where we're getting into this problem, and I don't think computer scientists are going to solve that problem at all. We really need to understand under which condition, the leash, the constraint, achieve something, and that's where we need you.
So we have one more question here.
Yeah, hi. I'm thinking about tomorrow's papers.
Okay.
And I'm going to ask a question that has two parts, which the idea is to try to link the two. Your historical account begins in the 1830s and 40s.
Yes.
And it's commercial. So the first question is, big data is often linked with the state statistics, 18th century censuses.
Yes.
Why leave out the state? Second, the dual market, La Presse and New York Tribune, perhaps in the Francophone world, begins 1830s, but in the Anglophone world, goes back to the 1720s. And in fact, the dual markets were very important in Philadelphia newspapers in the 1790s, in which you have content sold to advertisers, content sold to an audience, and the audience is sold to advertisers. Why truncate the understanding of those dual markets by the 1830s? And I guess what I'm getting at is, your account is very much driven by contemporary events. You're looking backward. But if we look forward, the narrative's different, the state looms larger, and it doesn't make much sense to start in the 1830s.
That's great. I'm so glad I can, because I very rarely have the chance to show that to people who have this knowledge. So first, was there example before 1830s of a newspaper paid by ads? Because that's the main, okay. And significantly with a low price paid by ads? Okay. So, all right. so then I should definitely fix that. For whatever reason, I got that wrong. Then absolutely right. I'm absolutely for polishing this historical perspective. Not to go back to your question about the state. I'm not going to, reproduce Zubov's argument, which is much more complete and knowledgeable than me. But my understanding of, reading your book was that it's unprecedented to have so little oversight. Like, the state had, there's at least, in the US and in other places, some form of control. I mean, there are transparency, Freedom of Information Act request, and ways in which when the state goes wrong, there are ways to sort of, run a feedback loop. Now we're talking about Facebook, where one person earns 55% of the chair with a veto power over their opinion of what should be done in the network. So in terms of the counterweight we have, I think we have much more counterweight in the state case than in the case of a privately owned company. At least those two examples. I'm not saying this is true all the time, but and it's kind of an interesting point, because I come from Europe, where we are very, very acute to the effect of states. In fact, all our regulation in Europe is about privacy because we care, to Germany and the effect of totalitarian regime, we are basically very careful not having a state with too much information. That's something we definitely, all the legal framework is made to protect from that, which is not exactly what the US tradition is looking at. In fact, the US tradition is way more to protect against discrimination. That was a much more historical prejudice present here. So in a form, I remember working in privacy in the early 2010s. Nobody in the US really cared too much. And, I was talking with some lawyers. Of course, people care, but it doesn't look like the things were moving too much. And as soon as online the idea was it's not just about privacy and protecting from the state, it's about discrimination on the basis of your race, your gender, your age online, then suddenly everything wake up. The FTC, the FCC, the law school, everyone suddenly, rise to the fact that there is a big problem. And I think it comes from the historical difference of the two countries. So that probably provides a little bit of an insight why I focused here on the US and not so much on the state. But you're right. I mean, that should be accounted for as well. And you're right that some people, I didn't say that, but when you ask people when did big data start, one of the common answers is the US Census in 1904 or 5, I'm not sure, but around those days. That was the first use of automated. 1890. But and with the card that was automated. Right. Okay. All right. Okay. So that's I'm corrected in real time. That's great. This is why we have those meetings. So that time is sometimes. I remember Steve Law from the New York Times was naming that the beginning of big data, for him. So that's another acceptable answer, and I don't think there's a real answer. I'm picking mine, but you're right that we can have a debate about what is the right time to start this. Thank you so much. And I'm staying here for more questions if you didn't have a chance to ask, of course.
So let's thank Augustine, and I hope you'll come tomorrow.